But as folks are kind of entering the chat or entering the meeting today, I'll go ahead and start off by introducing myself. My name is Shondine Jones. I am the current communications manager working with Flower Hill Institute on a few initiatives for meat and poultry, as well as FSA initiatives for technical assistance. And today I'll be co-moderating the event for the Food in a Changing Environment Symposium. I'll allow our panelists today to introduce themselves. But before that, I'll go ahead and give a brief overview about today's meeting or today's discussion. So we're having a discussion regarding food systems in the North American continent in the US. And we brought in a few professional experts on indigenous foodways. And we're going to discuss foodways from an indigenous lens, both historically, contemporarily, and kind of bring it into the discussion in context of climate change. Climate change from global temperatures rising, shifts in weather patterns, as well as just the environment of living in a current pandemic, and how our foodways and food systems have transitioned and kind of changed and morphed throughout history, and just kind of in the contemporary context of the environment that we're facing now. And yeah, we still have a few folks joining us today, but I wanted to start off by introducing our panelists and beginning to allow our panelists to kind of define three terms that we'll be using interchangeably in our discussion, just so that we can kind of have a good sense generally how we're using these terms and what we mean by these terms that we're going to be using. So the three questions that I kind of want to ask our panelists as they're introducing ourselves is, how would you define food and what would you categorize as food? In addition to, how would you define food as medicine? And then the third thing would be, how would you define food as poison? So just kind of touching on those three categories, those three terms that we'll be using interchangeably in the themes that we'll be discussing today. And I'll go ahead and kick off with the first person on my screen, Jerry Pardilla.
Good afternoon. I am Jerry Pardilla. I'm a citizen of Penobscot Nation in Central Maine, and I live in New Mexico. And I have an interest in food, not only for our sustenance, but also looking at the change of foods over time. And so looking at the terms of food, I have a very long view. And what I mean by that is looking at the food in the sense of a changing environment, and what we consider food for our physical sustenance, as well as for our spiritual and mental well-being. And so those that sustain us both physically and spiritually, I consider as food. And then what is poison? So that's a very challenging question, and not so much in the classic sense that there are those toxins that we may know of in our contemporary times, but poisons may be those foods that we may consume that become harmful to us. And so, I would think that in the deep changes, deep history and the changes that have occurred, we can see foods that have been introduced, or substances that have been introduced, and they become poisons to us. We can see any number of those that have deleterious effects. Dairy products and lactose, wheat products, a range of foods that we haven't had as Indigenous peoples the ability to make those accommodations. And then what I think also in the sense of medicine may not be perceived as in our contemporary sense of something that would be healing in the sense of prescribed medicine that we may get from a medical doctor. But medicine also includes the practices and the ceremonies that are associated with food economies and agricultural complexes. So in my own tribal traditions, we know that corn was a gift to us from our grandmother, and that is something that is for our physical sustenance. But coming associated with corn was tobacco, to be used for our spiritual well-being. And so while their contemporary understandings of tobacco, my ancestral one is tobacco had a very medicinal and spiritual healing quality to it. So there's different notions about what is considered food and poison and medicine that have diverse interpretations depending upon which Indigenous people and cultures you're speaking about.
Right. Awesome. Thank you, Jerry. And then Janice, I see Janice on the call here, who will also be another co-panelist. So Janice, I'll let you introduce yourself and kind of touch on the three terms and how you define it, how you view it, and what you would categorize as food, medicine, and poison.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Janice Lucero. I'm from the Pueblo of Isleta. I own and operate Cotton Blossom Gardens. I grow on ancestral inherited land in Isleta Pueblo on about a 1/4 acre of land, and I grow a variety of different vegetables. Thank you so much for having me here today, and I'm excited for this conversation. And to touch on what Shandin said is, what do we define as food? And for me, I feel like, anything that is safe, edible, and consumable: berries, vegetables, herbs, fruits, teas, herbs, water, anything that holds sense. Also, the question, you brought up is, what do you find as poison as it relates to food? And I believe for me, there's a lot that can really be defined as poison. And really it's modified food, processed food, gorging, ultra processed food as well. Corn starches is a huge one. Glucose syrup that we see in a lot of our drinks that we consume. Corn oil, canola oil, soy oil, all of those things to me are poisonous. And lastly, what do you describe as medicine? And Jerry had a really great comment there with, Indigenous folks, we come from hunter-gatherers, and so we foraged for foods, that was beneficial for sustainment, but also, it is our way of life, and prayer and ceremonies revolve around food, and the giving and offering of what we have, the gratitude and acknowledgement of the good food that we get to grow, is medicine for us. And so, all of those are essential vitamins and minerals that pertain to good health. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. Those are good definitions. And up next, I have Micah McCarty, who is also a co-panelist today. Micah, we were just kind of going over some short answers for defining food, medicine, and poison, to kind of bring sort of some definition and clarity on the Indigenous perspectives of these terms. So Micah, you can go ahead and have the floor.
Thank you. I appreciate everybody's wise words. I have very similar things to share, just as the indigeneity of who we are and where we come from. We've got a lot in common. Just to highlight where I come from marine territory, where our foods from macaw predominantly derived from the ocean, and our ocean resources come from what I would consider the habitat of our culture. And I believe that my definition of food is really centered around our ancestral relationship to the marine territory and the living resources therein. And I think of poison. I think of the kinds of foods that our people early on were exposed to, and it weakened our constitution, and we became sick easier to the common cold and flu. And when the Indian agents realized that our traditional diet was that important to our health, they knew that our immune systems were compromised with the new Western foods that we were exposed to. And that's when they gave us smallpox again for a second, but intentional and more devastating time. So when I think about the kinds of foods that, people inherently have been groomed over generations to have that relationship with, that's food. Everything else is sort of a colonial livestock feed. And that can be poison to, like you don't put diesel fuel in a car that requires, high octane gas. So we have enzymes and other things in our bodies that specifically over time have been adapted to metabolizing our traditional foods. And then the other sort of things around medicine in association to our food systems is that the spiritual side of it. And I'm respectful of each and every one of our ceremonies that we have on Great Turtle Island. But what I hear from our elders and our speakers when we talk about the ceremony, when we're in prayer and feast mode, that part of ingesting that traditional food with the teachings is part of that medicine. And the food itself is medicine. The fact that we have a lot of food sovereignty movements nowadays is medicinal, and the fact that it's also decolonial. Like we're decolonizing things that have been impressed upon us. And so medicine beyond that, and shamanistic, and in the teachings around the different kinds of plants that have medicinal properties, I believe strongly in that. Just as it is around other sort of, fish and other sorts of traditional diets that our bodies have been acclimated to over generations. And then, on the other aspects around poison, beyond what was already mentioned, I think about how the pollution in our traditional territory has impacted various health concerns regarding fish consumption rates for people with traditions of high fish consumption in an environment where we have, say, the I-5 corridor and all the rain and the deluge of seasonal rainfalls in the I-5 corridor around Seattle, where we have, very serious and dangerous chemicals that have no obstruction straight into the watersheds and into the Puget Sound, affecting the traditional territory of our salmon people that we have a relationship with. So the fact that we have to calculate fish consumption rates that are safe to consume our traditional diet in a government-to-government relationship with the state of Washington and its Department of Ecology, and the work that we do with the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, those kind of things. When we think about the natural sources of food that we depend on, and how many sources of contamination impact the food that we eat. To me, that's a pretty significant definition of how our traditional foods have become poisoned.
Right. No, I definitely agree with that. And then we have another co-panelist next on my screen, Nick Hernandez. Nick Hernandez, we are going through 3 terms that we'd like to define and kind of set the tone for some of the later on discussions of food as medicine, food as poison, and just kind of what we define as food and categorize as food, along with an introduction of yourself and your background in agriculture and food systems.
Wow, I don't know as a co-panelist. But my name is
You
Nick
got it.
Hernandez. Chris, everybody, my name is Nick Hernandez. I am the founder and CEO of Makoche Agriculture Development. We are a nonprofit organization focusing on agriculture and food systems development. We are place-based on the Pioneer Indian Reservation in the state known as South Dakota. So yeah, we are working on a variety of diverse opportunities related to agriculture production by way of raising poultry, processing systems, building a multi-purpose community food hub, and utilizing regenerative practices and educating and teaching our community through place-based community education training, and developing the next innovators for our community. So that's a little bit about the organization. In answering the questions, I probably have to say, what were the 3 questions again?
Yeah, how would you define food, categorize as food, and outside of that, what would you define and categorize as poison and food as medicine?
Oh, okay. I mean, I've been in this work for about 15 years, and the relationship to food actually grew from the relationship with my grandmother. And so what I really saw as food is that which is local to you, and that which you can learn from. And we've been really learning about what is food from everything from the tree bark to the seeds to the leaves, and then now going into modern times to food that you can raise with like modern chickens, which is not traditional from where we raise them, but it's traditional in another part of the world. And so I guess what is food to me is food that you have a understanding and a relationship with, and knowing where that food comes from. So it's having a relationship. Food that is medicine is something I'm still working on, but I found that a lot. I have found that having that relationship to food creates that relationship to it as medicine, to understanding its properties, of the way it makes you feel, of where it come from, how you treated that food, and not only raising it, but how you stewarded the use of that food. And so food as medicine can mean many things. I'm a tribal member of the tribe of the Oglala Sioux tribe, and a nation member of the Ocheti Shakoi. And so we have a real relationship with food, just like everybody else in indigenous country, because our food is the foundation of our culture, of our identity. And so identifying it as medicine is real important, because it's what identifies our entire being, and what actually creates life for our entire being. And so, to get more indigenous on that, but foods that are bad, I mean, I think everybody's identifying those that we are not connected to, and those that are, I would probably say modified without understanding. But I mean, a lot of non-indigenous colonial foods are very bad, and we see the impact within the health statistics, the health and the demographics within our communities by the deaths, by the rise in disparities. And so food is a real important factor to life, and it's something that we should take great understanding and great connectivity to understand within our own personal life, and then that within our communities, because the food is the foundation of our culture and being.
Right. No, for sure. And thank you for joining us, Nick, on such short notice. And our last panelist, who is here today, Joseph Toledo. So we're just kind of going through some definitions of terms that we'll be using. So Joseph, if you wanted to expand on the terms that we're discussing, food as medicine, and food as poison, as well as introducing yourself. We'll go ahead and lean into our first discussion, introduced by Roger Frawa. So Joseph.
Yes, good evening. My name is Joseph, better preferably called Brophy Toledo. I'm from the Pueblo of Havens. I've been a farmer since I've been a young boy and grew up in the fields all the time because food is medicine. I'm also a herbalist that joins both herbs and foods together to create that biodegradable foods that we need in a lot of our eating habits. You know, I know we were one of the healthiest people in the world when we were all into the fields and we were hunting all our game, you know, and everything was so natural until, you know, the first foods that I know that ever came in was commodities, you know, and once commodities came in, everybody looked forward to getting commodities, you know, until later on we found out what commodities really are. And they were like, that's like eating poison, you know, because we're getting a lot of those cheeses, we're getting a lot of the large grease and all these other non-edible foods. So, you know, that's one way that I see a lot of it changing because I've been doing what I'm doing since at the age of 11. And I remember a long time ago when the older medicine people were sitting there and they were in their 90s and they grew up in the 1800s listening to stories that were told to them in the 1700s about how it was going to change with a lot of our eating habits, especially foods, man. So one time I was sitting in there, you know, and a lot of times our village people would bring us food, and one time they brought pop in. So I opened a can of pop, and they went, and they asked me, "What is that?" And I told them it's a can of Coke. So they asked me what in there. So I told them, I said, "Man, I have all this stuff. I can't even read what they are." And their quote was, "You better find out what it is because that is going to change the health of people." And they were so right. Because after we started consuming all these outside foods, so store-bought foods, and we started forgetting about our own plantations, you know, everybody sort of got lazy, and everybody depended on store-bought foods. So today, you know, I know that, you know, we still try to keep that healthy lifestyle. And I'm always introducing herbal ways, you know, herbal lives, herbal remedies, you know, because a lot of our running programs that we have here depended a lot on our medicinal plants that were out there because animals were our teachers, you know, like especially with our running. We always saw the deer, the four-legged, and what they were eating. And what they were eating was what made them who they were when they started prancing. They never dug, man. They jumped, you know, they never dug into the ground. So we said maybe we eat what that animal eats, we'll be more healthier. And that's what happened. We started learning about that, what the eating habits were with deers, and that's how we did a lot of our running remedies that we were using out here in Hemis. So, you know, I know that that's not the only thing. I know animals taught us a lot about the eating habits because what they were eating became a lot of the herbs we're using today because they were the healthiest animals, you know, and they helped us clothe, they help us with shelter. Their intelligence really taught humans a big lesson. And we followed those ways, yes, because a lot of our dancing that we do, we're still honoring those dances for what they have done for us. You know, even the ants, you know, I always look at ants. You know, ants tell me how weather's gonna change. Ants were always a teacher about how weather was gonna change. You know, if you ever notice in the summer, you'll notice the ants when they're piling right close to their home, they know bad weather's gonna come in because you don't want to be way out there when the rains come. You want to be close to home. So we started learning all this stuff, you know, and I know that the animal ways are always very important because in a lot of our healing practices, those were a lot of the healing energies where medicine people come from, depending on those animals, the four-legged, the winged, the fin, the microinvertebrates, the pollinators, you know, and all that was used for a purpose. And today, you know, we're bringing that memory back to our native youth and everybody else that's here, you know, that we need to go back on the land because when we plant, we know how we grow our foods. Then going into a store and buy their foods because we never know how they grew them, man. They might use fertilizer, pesticides, or whatever they're going to use, and we're consuming that. So the natural way was always the best way, you know. And I know that for a fact that, you know, over here in our pueblo, we have thousands of acres of lands that are not used because everybody sort of got lazy and now depended on the stores. But now we're telling them, you know, your own homegrown foods are the best because you know how you grew it, you know how hard you work on the land, and the therapeutic energies that come up from the land is what built you to be that good dancer you want to be. So even in the song and the dance moves, a lot of those moves were practiced in the fields, in our agricultural fields. We always sang to our plants, we talked to our plants, we grow them. They said when you plant that seed, you grow it. When it comes out, you grow it that you will grow your own children. Your children need clothing. Your children need the cleanliness in their house. They need to be washed and fed and all this. So, and once it matures, you know, they said that you don't need that much attention anymore. But you always go out there and tend to your crops. You go out there, you sing to them. I go out there, I play the flute. I teach the kids about why we grow them the way we grow them. And when we dance, on why we dance, because we dance for the crops. And we do cloud roll dances. When we do our dances, the clouds roll in. When they gather, then that sacred water in the clouds come down and they feed all our medicinals to everything we have in the fields that we're growing. So everything has that connectivity that needs to be, understood. And once you understand your reason why you do the way you do it, then you're gonna have a reason. Once you walk into that kiva, you know, we go into the kiva. That's where we dress up from the bottom of our feet to the top of our head, top of the feet, top of the head to the bottom. That attire we wear. If you know what you're wearing and why you use the attire you're using, then you're going to have a reason why you're dancing. So all my kids over here, what I want them to say is if they ask on why you're dancing, all I want them to say is because of water. Water is what we're doing it for, man. Water is life, man. That's what they all say, and it's so true. So, you know, we use a lot of evergreens. And I teach why we use evergreens because you yourself want to be forever green. That's why we use evergreens. And then the next thing is I tell them is, who's going to water that evergreen? So what I tell my kids is, your dance is going to water those evergreens in the mountains. So now they have a good reason why they're dancing. They have a good reason why their attire is worn the way it does. And it just brings a good feeling back to them that in our indigenous ways that, you know, everything is so understood and has a reason. And those balancers that I'm talking about is held in your hands because everything creates in your hands. Belief and trust, what I talk about, is in your hands. And by doing that performance, doing that honor dancing for your crops, for animals, for plants, or whatever you're doing it for, at the end, it all amounts to health and wellness. So those are the reasons why it's so important that we have our children understand, because in our indigenous ways, I'm not saying that my only Pueblo holds those things. I said every indigenous nation owns this, from our dance, the attires to everything that we do. Because in this world, Earth people, we're all given equal. Nobody was given more, nobody was given less. Everybody was given the same. So that same equality that everybody got needs to play at the same role now, because some of it is being forgotten, especially our kids that are out there in the urban cities, But I know that for a fact that, I work with a lot of urban cities that are bringing agriculture back. A lot of our native kids that are in the cities really want it. I know that because they're the ones that have the most questions when you have seminars or sessions or whatever, man. And they really want to know their own self-identity on who they really are. So that's where it's all based on, what kind of shoes do you wear? Are you wearing your right shoes? Are you wearing it the right way? And it's your whole ingenuity, that thought process that you have. Does it have a beneficial thought behind it with everything that you do? Because the other stuff is too easy. To get in trouble is too easy. That's the easiest thing to do, man. But the hard way is, man, your own Indian life is hard. But the beneficial part is when you go to the doctor, they don't find anything wrong with you, man, because it's your health wise is so good that everything is so stable, everything is in that comfort zone that you need to be in. So that's what agricultural does, and a lot of the plants that are out there, adding them into foods for flavoring, those need to come back, adding stuff into our stews, the herbs that will build that medicine in food instead of creating that poison. That's how you change all this into making it into a good consumable health product that you're going to be consuming. So there's a lot of different ways that we need to bring the teachings back to our kids, to our students, that is going to really open up their eyes and really benefit themselves to be that good athlete you want to be out there, especially being out there in the ball field, playing baseball, basketball, football, to whatever you do. Therapy is right there in the field, man. And that's, it's hard work, but if you have a good reason why you're doing it, your performance is going to go good anywhere you do your activity. So that's where it's at. And I think that, what we're doing here now is beneficial to everybody to understand our own world together to create this. So that's where I'm coming from. And that's where it needs to be. Thank you.
No, for sure. I agree with that, Brophy. Appreciate that background as well, with bringing in kind of the intent behind these food to turn into medicine to combat poison. But before we get into a deeper conversation about food and medicine and poison, I wanted to also introduce Roger Frawa, who is the executive director of Flower Hill Institute, as well as the co-moderator for today's discussion. I'll allow Roger to introduce himself and kind of go more into depth about food as medicine and kind of the intent behind today's symposium. Roger?
Shondine, honored to be here with you and the 24 other folks that are on this Zoom. As I think back about the tribal affiliations that are here, it's the Salmon Nations, the Buffalo Nations, the Rice Nations, Corn Nations, and the Acorn Nations. When we start thinking about, all those different geographic, regional food and food stuffs and food systems, whether we think about that from a historical context, from a contemporary context, and then in a changing environment from a future context, it really makes for a very fascinating discussion. And my hope and my aspiration is that we run out of time today before we run out of conversation. We really want to make sure that the students of the 5 Boston colleges, which were introduced to us by Chris Roper, introducing us to Adam Silver. And when we started talking about, this opportunity to have this discussion, it was just fascinating, at least for me, for sure, to be able to engage in a conversation and really make this more, conversational than presentational. I think there's enough folks on this call that I know fairly well that could really take the next hour and a half just in presentations. It would be none of us would be bored, I promise. But I think under that guise of really trying to keep this diverse discussion going, my name is Roger Frau. I am from the Pueblo of Jemez. I am the executive director of Flower Hill Institute. Can be found at flowerhill.institute. If you're ever interested to see the 4 pillars of cultural preservation, youth indigenous knowledge, STEM camps, climate action, and agriculture. And the most amazing thing about Flower Hill and our migration or our journey is really not the programs. It's not the people inside of it. It really is our amazing board of director who have been elected by their own peoples, not just sat on, but chaired a national Indian organization that's done something amazingly impactful for Indian country, and are currently working with tribes on a regional intertribal basis. And that leadership that we have, like many other tribal leaders, are just amazing, and keeping us pointed toward that North Star as an organization and an entity. When we start thinking about Flower Hill and the kind of migration story that we have, really kind of looking forward and leading into the 2024 season, and thinking about partnerships and alliances. We believe very strongly in the power of one, and I think the power of one is really amazing when one person really kind of, as Brophy said, put your head down and kind of lean into it. But when you look on the screen and you see 24 participants, these 24 participants coming from the salmon, buffalo, rice, corn, acorn nations, there's a lot that can happen here. And so we really wanted to kind of make this conversation more of a involved conversation. So please use chat to ask questions. We'll be monitoring that as we talk, and Shandine will be able to read chat and lob in comments, questions into the discussion as we move forward. So hoping to facilitate this, Micah, not to put you on the spot, but I know that you and I have spent some time at Nia Bay with the Makah tribe, and I understand very well your whaling background. And when I start thinking about whales coming from the Corn Nation, God, I wish we had some water. And you look out every day on your Olympic Peninsula and the very northwestern tip of these United States, and you see whales kind of passing by your horizon there. And can you describe, maybe from a historical context, for those of you who don't know, if you go to YouTube and you look up whale puppet, canoe journey, things like that, you'll see Micah McCarty kind of following in his grandfather's steps by bringing in a ceremonial whale onto land, into shore, into ceremonial grounds. And Mike, if you don't mind, can you describe a little bit about the Makah tribe and its whaling background, but kind of in a nutshell, that might be of interest to, certainly of interest to me for sure, but in interest to those who don't have that whaling background. And this is the only, my understanding is the Makah tribe is the only legally whaling tribe in these United States. And Micah, as a whaling person and the former chairman of the Makah tribe, and that cultural background and his affinity to whale, which is very unique. I don't think there's a lot of tribes that can speak about that. So while we have that diverse perspective, can you talk about just kind of a snippet of Makah and its affinity to whaling from a historical context?
Sure. Thank you, Roger. First of all, I just wanted to share that our traditional territory has been widely recognized by Western scientists as one of the most dynamic marine ecologies on the planet for productivity and biological diversity. So much of what swims into the Salish Sea, what was known as the Puget Sound swims past us at Macaw. We have a lot of highly migratory species that also transect our area, being whales and sea lions. And we also have a very rich abundance of what we call domicile species that are not migratory, long-lived rockfish species that live in the same area for a long time. But when it comes to the whaling traditions and the connection with these ancestral teachings, one of the biggest things that I feel is sort of maybe a zenith or an apex of our hunter-gatherer society is whaling, but it's also one of the prime examples of how we personify the living spirit within the creature that we consume. And so the spiritual connection to the relationship, it brings what I refer to as keeping the living breath of our ancestors alive. And so the spiritual food for our life's journey, are the spirit that we carry in our bodies, or rather than the spirit that animates our minds. We understand that in all of the creatures that we take life from when we usher that spirit away. And one of the most profound teachings from one of my cousins, Nuquismia, explained to me that in some of the most important rituals in honoring that spirit journey is to do it in a way that it's accepted by those that came before it in the same way. So we're acknowledging a society of whales that have been properly hunted that will accept this new one. And the whale ceremony that you mentioned, Roger, is something I was brand new on council in 2005, and I was pretty optimistic about the waiver requests that we were forced to go through because of a court case that basically held hostage the U.S. government's trust responsibility to our treaty rights. I don't surrender my treaty rights to a dysfunctional federal system. And when the tribal journeys, all the canoes in the Northwest gathered in Lower Elwha, our canoe family had asked us, Macaw Tribal Council, if we would step up one day and host. And so we made that announcement, and I boldly predicted that we will have whale. And later on in 2010, while we're about 5 weeks away from the hosting the journeys and all the canoes getting ready to come, the same cousin that pressured us also said that the elders are talking about a big ceremony that was done out at Wyatch about 100 years ago then. And that was a ceremony that my great-grandfather had done, and my great-grandfather's generation was the last of the chiefs to live that old way. The last to defend the territory in ways of our own system of capital punishment. And we had a lot of different traditions that went away at that time. And so it was at a time of very harsh and violent forced change on our people that my great-grandfather Hishkoop Sonaxi did a Thunderbird and whale puppet ceremony. And in my reflection on that, it was a testament to the fortitude of preserving our sovereignty, that we're not surrendering our sovereign relationship to our foods, our culture, and that connection in between. And so then when my cousin told me that the people at the Elders Center wanted to see this, it wasn't just an idea anymore. And they said now they're expecting it. And so I went to my council and I told them what the deal was, and I talked with my dad, and everybody knew that was from my family that did this last. And so I was authorized to spend time on council in preparation for this whale puppet. So then I joke, back in 2005, I said, we're going to have whale, but I didn't say we could eat it. On the sarcasm aspect of it, but the ceremony has a larger teaching to it, and the lightning serpents that were designed to come out of the mouth of the whale were part of the teachings of the literacy of our territory. And I think about the traditional ecological knowledge that is spoken, around Indian country these days. For us, that traditional ecological knowledge was embodied in our sea serpent, our lightning serpent headdress dances. And I think about it's the illumination from the stars, the tops of the mountains to the sea floor. We know what our territory has, and we know how our territory behaves. We are a functioning element of our territory. And so when I think about our traditional ways of hunting and gathering, we are akin to the natural predators, and that allegiance that we have with the wolves and the killer whales and all these other, magnificent predators have an important function in the ecosystem for balance. And so that's a bit of what I can share on that now, I guess.
Micah, thank you for that. I think, again, it's fascinating when you start thinking about whale. I mean, many people might understand when you go out and, fish, but whale's a whole different matter in terms of scale and, how do you process that? How do you bring it home? How do you share it amongst your community members? I mean, those kinds of things. It's just fascinating to think about that ancestral process is still alive and well, thanks to leaders like yourself. I want to switch from the Salmon Nation to the Buffalo Nation. Nick, not to put you on the spot, Nick, but I think when those of us who are not in the Northern Plains, we hear about prehistoric warfaring, Crow, Sioux, Cheyenne, kind of in those Northern Plain neighborhoods, and you think about that free roaming, herds of buffalo that would be processed. I think when you think about the Atlantic Monthly that was published back in 1992, and you read that fascinating article that they say evidenced prehistoric warfaring tribes sharing sustenance, sharing the buffalo almost as a managed herd, not quite domesticated, but really as a managed herd, to be able to have your enemies have food and sustenance to carry them through, to live another day to fight some more. Nick, can you share any information from a historical context about the Buffalo Nations and sharing sustenance with your enemy as a historical context? Because that, if you think about warfaring in today's terminology, Gaza, Ukraine, Russia, China, Taiwan, I'm not so sure when you hear about humanitarian aid trying to wrestle itself into Gaza. And I think when you think about prehistoric warfaring tribes in the Northern Plains of Turtle Island here, and how very intentionally those tribes would share between amongst each other so they had sustenance. Is there any truth to that, Nick, or can you give any background color, dispute that and say, no, that was not true, it was, somebody else's idea?
Be that we are written out of the history books altogether, and my state just changed civic its entire civic learning all last year to be written out of the history books. This is going to be one of those questions that probably comes from a deep anthropological research dive. But in truth, like, I guess coming from me being in this work for a long time, in trying to look at research and pictures, I would probably say that there would probably be a relationship built on food, right? On warring, on sharing, because um, you know, as a buffalo, as a buffalo nation, um, we revolved around everything that the buffalo provided, and that was everything from shelter to tools to food. And so I would imagine that there was a relationship with with other warring tribes, um, based on territory, but there had to be a respectable relationship, um, to that of the buffalo, because what is identified, or what is historically identified as a population size of 60 million buffalo used to roam, um, Turtle Island, which, like I said, um, Turtle Island or the Great Land, and that's a lot. I mean, that is a large population, you know, and we weren't as big as a population, total population as we are now, but I would imagine that, you know, sustenance, you know, abundance was that, but also making sure that people were taken care of within our communities, but also having that relationship to food was very important during times of probably great need. And so I would probably say that yeah, it was probably some form of relationship building because, you know, not only within culture but also within society is how you know, you make relatives, or you have feast days, or you have ceremony. It all entails sharing of food. And so I guess just to dive from there, that's there's a lot. And there's also a lot of, you know, undocumented sharing that I myself and my team and even community members, you know, we're trying to research and share. But what we've come to understand is that food is that foundation to our lifeways and to our culture. I mean, it's tied to everything, you know, how we how we create relationships, but also one of the other speakers talked about um, you know, watching the animals and learning from them, and that was real key. That was real key to creating our societies. And we as Lakota people, you know, our relationship is strong in origin from the Buffalo Nation because they teach us everything about our generational, you know, transformation and our growth on how the buffalo, you know, treats each other from the youngest of age to the oldest of age. So, I mean, in response, that's kind of what I've learned, what I've been learning um, through my years of not only being a relative, but also learning about my traditional life ways.
Appreciate that, Nick. Thank you. Thank you for that context for that time period. You know, as we migrate this conversation from a historical to maybe more of a contemporary time frame, and we start thinking about all of our families' histories, whether you're from the salmon, buffalo, rice, corn, acorn nations. I think if you think back about our grandparents, our great grandparents, and then their grandparents, you start thinking about the kind of transition that those generations lived through, where there was 60,000 buffalo, Nick, you know, you start thinking about the kinds of harvests we had on, you know, farmed and wildland harvests, and then the deer and the elk and the moose up in Penobscot, and the fishing in the Salish Sea. And when you think about the Yakima River and it's running wild, and you look at those platforms and those dip nets, you know, you start thinking about all those kinds of plentiful foodstuffs, and then how those generations really suffered from that kind of harmony relationship with food and foodstuffs. And Micah, as you had suggested earlier, about paying homage in a cultural way to those animals and foodstuffs that willingly gave themselves to us, and we honored those animals. I mean, you come to the Pueblo country and you see our animal dances at virtually every single Pueblo during this time of year, and herds of deer and buffaloes and antelope and elk and rams and whatnot. And you see the kind of respect that we pay to those animals who have given themselves to us for sustenance, and then how we return that honor back to them in a ceremonial way. And there's that symbiotic relationship. You think about the rich landscapes and customs, traditions, ceremony, food, song, dance that we all come from, whether you're Indian or non-Indian. And then you think about that transition from very bountiful lifestyles to starvation and hunger. And I think that, those of us who have relationship with our grandparents and those elders and those stories that were handed down to us, all those stories of really deep hunger. I know that I myself came from hunger. When I was like a little boy, I mean, hunger was one of those things that I had to deal with because of the social aspects of my upbringing, and how that has shaped and affected me to who I am to this very day in terms of my work ethic, those kinds of things. Is I just don't want to go hungry again. And I've heard it said, if you've been poor, you can never be rich. So I think it's that kind of hunger sometimes that drives us, and it drives our diabetes, it drives our obesity, it drives our hypertension, because we don't know when we're going to eat again. And that is deep in our DNA. We wonder why, like, why do we do these things that we know, as Brophy and Shandin started talking about, food is poison. I think that's some of that aspect. Even though we know it's poison, we still eat it, even knowingly. We still eat it because maybe we're hungry and we don't want to go hungry. So you start thinking about those fantasies about Thanksgiving, and the kumbaya, and we put out these great big feasts, for the colonizers that were coming into our territories. And then you think about the federal Indian relationship, the federal government. It was already mentioned, commodities and those kinds of things. Those are all those transitional periods between the historic and the contemporary associations we have with food and foodstuffs. So I would put hunger in there, Thanksgiving, federal Indian relationship. But now bring us to where we are today. You don't have to think back too far to think about $8 billion coming into Indian country in the form of a response to COVID. And we had really strict checkpoints and lockdown. Here in Jemez, where I come from, an adult between 18 and 55 could leave the community one day a week for 4 hours to run into a town. And we live 38 miles from the closest grocery store, and you had to go into town, pick up your groceries for the entire week, and come back. And then, because there was very strict checkpoints and lockdown, and COVID obviously has made, it was something that ravished the planet. But when you think about the real things that have afflicted Indian country, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, where's the checkpoint for that? And then, we think about the federal government and its federal Indian relationship and the trust responsibility it has to Indian people. Why did we have checkpoints, back in my great-grandfather's day and my grandfather's day, to make sure that we weren't bringing in sugar and processed and white bleach flour and those kinds of things? Where were the checkpoints then that was really affecting our communities? And where's that federal Indian relationship? So Chris Roper, I know you're not a panelist, but I see you there, and I don't want to let that experience of you being here with us. Can you talk, Chris, about the COVID timeframe, and then specifically at the Wasaji, the Osage, when they could look out on their vast prairies, the largest tribe in Oklahoma? They make movies about this tribe. If you look at DiCaprio, Scorsese, and De Niro, Killers of the Flower Moon, and you start thinking about that particular tribe during COVID, they would look out on the range and see hoofed animals. They would see cattle, they would see buffalo. And yet they went to the stores in Tulsa, Oklahoma City, Skiatook, Bartlesville, Pahuska, and there was no food. There was no meat on those grocery store shelves. And Chris, can you describe, from a contemporary standpoint, from a Wasaji or an Osage perspective, the kind of work that you did to help that tribe respond to COVID?
Yeah. Thank you, Roger. I get Chris Roper. I work with Roger, Flower Hill Institute. Time flies, and as Roger and everyone have talked, I think about the 17 years that I have worked with tribes, and time definitely gets away from us all, and a lot of us have worked together in different capacities, different projects, and I'm honored and blessed to be able to travel around and help tribes all across the United States, and tribal producers, nonprofits, in all kinds of different food security projects. So, when you think about some of my history over those 17 years and where we are today, I do a lot of reflection, and Roger gets to see a lot of that because I usually send Roger an email when I have some of those really touching days, and this week I'm traveling. I've been in North Dakota, on the Standing Rock Reservation, and I traversed across South Dakota today to be in Rapid City, and I'll get to be with Nick tomorrow down on the Pine Ridge Reservation. So, as I traversed across South Dakota today, I literally saw more animals than people. When I saw the buffalo, the cattle, the antelope, roaming free in the fields, and though we do have more fences today, you think about that food security and where we are and what we've lost. Nick and I have spent a lot of time on these Zooms talking about, our history and our grandparents, as Roger and I have, and the things that we were taught and the things that we saw, and the things that, if you even think back to the Depression eras of how, our grandparents canned and struggled and fought, and Roger talks about hunger and, 40 miles to the grocery store. These things are still real, but we've lost these things in generations. I spent about 15 years working with the Quapaw tribe in Northeast Oklahoma, where we recognized early that food security was really lost within tribes. So we were starting to build food security programs within tribes, really starting about 2010, where we needed to make sure and bring buffalo back to the tribe. We brought cattle back to the tribe, greenhouses. We went so far as coffee roasting because we needed to raise money, to be able to sell products and be able to fund these food security initiatives. And when COVID hit, I'm totally blessed and honored to say that we were more ready than a lot of communities were, because we had meat processing already. We had animals on the land already. We had greenhouses, we had coffee, and you don't think about the black water as much, and you think about how many people drink that. But if you're controlling how that product is raised and made and produced, you feel better about that. You feel better about giving it out to your people. But when COVID hit, and as Roger mentioned, the store shelves are empty, we were able to control that supply in that entire community. We were able to move those animals through a processing plant as we needed to fill our own shelves and to share that food with other tribes that didn't have anything. We had refrigerated trucks, and we had coolers, and we had freezers that we could store product in and then move that product out. And when you think about Osage people specifically, Roger and I teamed up together. I believe it was in 2019 now, Roger, I can't remember the exact year, but and the exact time, but Osage was facing that issue, and 38,000 tribe members, that the chief was, how am I going to feed my people? How am I going to feed my kids, my elders? They were scattered out over, thousands of acres and hundreds of miles from store to store, and they did not have the food. The WIC programs weren't stocked, the FDIPR programs weren't getting stocked and delivered, and mind you that FDIPR programs, the food distribution program on Indian reservations, delivers once a month. So that once a month delivery wasn't getting there. So it wasn't enough. It's not enough today. So even if it does show up once a month, it's not enough. And that's what a lot of our fights are today, is to still make sure that we're feeding our people separate from these government programs that you've already heard about. The government programs are not enough, and they've never been enough. But the Osage decided, we have got to process our own meat. They already had cattle, they had some bison, but they had no way to process them. They did not have the greenhouses or the gardens. They didn't have the knowledge to take that on and to start it. But when they decided they were going to do it, we had to do a full court press during COVID to build that program and to get a meat processing built, operational, to build some greenhouses, and then to figure out how to train their people immediately to get them growing food so that they could feed their own people. That was their biggest concern, was help me feed my own people. And we went and did that, and now Roger and I are both blessed to be able to go out and share those experiences. COVID woke up a lot of people and a lot of tribes specifically, but I know last year alone, Roger and I worked with 81 tribes all across the United States. And a lot of the great people that you have on the call today are people we still work with in some capacity, either expanding the food security projects they already have, or some starting from scratch. We have people in all different phases of development of food security. And along those lines come the cultural knowledge that you've heard about as well. I was on the Standing Rock Reservation yesterday, and they still hold the quilting classes, the language classes. They have the greenhouses and the gardens to teach. And when we talk about planting seeds, you have to think about that in many ways. And when we're planting seeds, it's not only planting seeds in the ground, but you're planting those seeds in your young people. You're planting those seeds in the people that have been skipped by that generational knowledge of not knowing how to can their food, grow their food, process their food. So many of our foods have been pushed to not just the commodities, but the processed foods. And that's what we kind of get to, the food is poison and food is medicine. If we can control the growth, the production, and the processing of that food, we can definitely keep that food healthier and cleaner than it would be if we're getting those processed foods, the canned foods, the frozen foods that may or may not be available when you truly need them. So we get to spend a lot of time still today. We try to utilize and try to share the U.S. Department of Agriculture programs with people that are wanting to develop different food systems, and we're truly honored to be able to do that. So we want to share that knowledge and share that information. And a lot of the sharing we do is just like this evening, where we're sharing information and you're sharing contacts. So when you hear of one group doing one thing, as you traverse through your life, you'll remember that you heard that so-and-so was doing that, or maybe Micah, in the Northwest, they're fishing and whaling, and these things come back in your memory, and you will always know who to reach out to talk to. People are sharing, and especially in the tribal world, all the people on this call I've known for a long time, and we've been able to share information and resources for years and years, and we'll continue to do that to continue to spread the good word. So hopefully I didn't get too far off track there, Roger, but I wanted to share that info.
No, thank you, Chris. I think you speak about from a real world, traveling, no exaggeration, 4 to 5 days a week somewhere in Indian country. You're going to find Chris Roper advocating for tribal food security, and really working with leadership and individual rancher farmer types. And it was not a small feat. When I talk about the 2019 experience at Osage, the total dollars had to be spent, not just expended, actually money spent and delivered with an operating plant. And Chris was racing a December 30th deadline to have that plant opened, operational, certified. And if you can imagine doing that during COVID with supply chain, labor, social distancing, construction crews. I mean, just you can start imagining all the kinds of things that would go wrong during the construction of something like that, during call it a normal time, and then do that during COVID time, and with that kind of pressure, it was just an amazing feat. And I think that if it weren't for Chris Roper, and if it wasn't for Chief Jeffrey Standing Bear, really unleashing the entire, power of the tribe and all of its people and its resources, and being singly focused on, doing one thing to feed its people, and meeting that deadline was just kind of short of amazing. So Chris, thank you for who you are and what you do in Indian country. Indian country knows you and respects you for the kind of work that you do and the commitment that you have to Indian country. So thank you for that illumination of that COVID experience. I think that was important. Moving forward, just looking at time. So in the last kind of third of the hour that we want to kind of skate toward get to the top of the hour for Q&A, and that's where we hope that we'll have a really good discussion. When we start thinking about words like food sovereignty, when I first heard food sovereignty about a dozen years ago, and this was up at the Oneida Nation in Wisconsin, and a lot of young people were talking about food and food sovereignty. And I kept thinking to myself, if we use the word sovereignty so much, we're going to dilute that word, and it's not going to have the impact to the local government, to states, to the federal government even. If we start using the word so often, we start to maybe cheapening that word. So as we start thinking about contemporary times moving forward in the transition into future times, words like food sovereignty, and you start thinking about the subject of the call is food in a changing environment. And geez, coming from New Mexico, we can talk to you about a changing environment, claiming host to the two largest, fires in the West. There's probably not much left to burn here in New Mexico. We all shared the hottest July on record last year in 2023 until this year, right? I mean, we used to think about Menominee and the kind of weather and snow and things that they have up that way, and like, well, we probably won't be heading there anytime soon, and we'll wait till it kind of thaws out. But I'm hearing from folks at the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and said, no, it's like 60 degrees up there, just even like just last week. And the kind of things that, in terms of that changing environment with a capital C and a capital E, really changing environment. Jerry, can you talk a little bit about fish and moose and things like that? Coming from the Penobscot Nation in Maine, Jerry, you and I have known each other for a very long time. When I start thinking about cold weather and folks in New England and moose and fish, can you give us a report from your perspective as the former executive director of the National Tribal Environmental Council, the current director of United South and Eastern Tribes and its environmental programs, and as the former chief of the Penobscot Nation? Can you talk a little bit about, Jerry, your perspective of food, not just fish and moose, but food in a changing environment from your perspective?
Thank you, Roger. So pardon me, you hear my dogs in the background. I hope it's not too distracting. I've really been thinking about this for some time, Roger, and thinking about our environment and changes in our environment. I'll try to be really concise and say that my view goes back to how the environment changed and produced changes in my people's living in that Northeast area that we call Wabanaki, the land of the dawn, where the sun rises on Turtle Island. And so our people were there at the glacial period, and when the glacier receded, we were on the land and began to adapt to to those changes, going from a tundra-like environment to today, where we have the vast the forests and the river systems and the lakes and the ocean nearby. But that wasn't there so long ago. But the rate of change allowed us to adapt to that and adapt lifestyles and learn about how to live in that region. And so the changes in technology, the changes in our diet, and our relationships to all of our relatives in the land, whether they were swimming or walking on four legs or flying, we had a relationship with them. And so we've heard in our early panels talking about relationships, but there also are responsibilities as well, to be good relatives in that area. And so what I've been thinking about is not only the overall change in the environment, but the rate of change and how those kinds of changes will produce the health effects that we have. So I can go to a period in the 1500s when white people were first meeting Europeans, particularly explorers and fishermen coming into our North Atlantic area. And in that Columbian exchange, bringing disease to us that caused cataclysmic population losses, greater than 90%, and then other waves that followed afterwards. And so that caused us to adapt. But and it happened very rapidly. And how do you retain your social order and your traditional knowledges and your life ways? And so those were dramatic periods that I think about that affected our relationship with each other and also with our relatives in the land. Now, we moved into our colonial period, and we had our treaties and loss of territories, loss of access to those places where we hunted, where we fished, where we trapped, and old village sites that were well established for our farming. And then the warfare that happened in those early years, and the destruction of our fields, our cornfields in particular. And so those brought dramatic changes. And then we're in the reservation period. And then transitioning from our traditional economies into a capitalist system with wage earner economies, and how that became very limiting. And so in my lifetime, coming through that period of time of economic depression, and where my grandparents were receiving commodity foods and being raised in that environment where I'm exposed to eating proteins that came out of a can, as opposed to our ancestral ways of hunting and living off the land. And so we saw this change and how it gets internalized and how it brings us forward to so far away from the self-reliance that we had and our community cooperation and our intertribal trade routes. Now we're isolated in reservation lands, and facing enormous challenges, to the point where now we're receiving commodity foods and not to supplements, often as a main part of our dietary daily dietary requirements. And so fast forward a bit, moving into a period of modernization and going through a land claim settlement process and regaining more of our lands, and reversing the trend of living literally hand to mouth from federal programs and commodity foods, to restoring our hunting ways and our hunting knowledge, and reclaiming our traditional corns and our vegetables, and regaining that traditional knowledge of medicines. So what I think is really more about the idea of the importance not only of the species, but the symbolism of the salmon and the moose, where the hydro dams on the Penobscot River were primary barriers for sea-run fish, and the removal of certain dams to restore 1,000 miles of fish habitat for those sea-run fish, and the return of the salmon. And so we are seeing what is the reclaiming of those important food species and our relatives through alliance with others. And not only is it restoring our own well-being, but we're carrying out a responsibility to be good relatives for the fish or the moose and the natural environment, the rivers. The river is a being in and of herself, and so that we're breaking out of this notion of that things are that there are sentient relatives that don't fit neatly into the Western science taxonomy, that we're related, and reclaiming our traditional cultural understandings. So the symbolism, we are hunting moose today. The practical reality is that we have a responsibility to maintain the habitat and to have that relationship with the moose and also with the salmon. We know that our own genetics are attuned to those species and others within our natural environment. By maintaining healthy relatives, we also maintain our own health and our place in the responsibility of, as was given to us or taught to us by our elders.
Jerry, thank you for that. Really very much appreciate that. As we start skating down toward the top of the hour, Janice, I wanted to ask you, you and I have talked about the immense strength of the women of Isleta Pueblo and, kind of the rich history of many of those that have come before you. And we've mentioned some of their names in conversation. Janice, with your technical background, your political background, your political action background, your farming background, your a mother, a parent, and an aunt, all these different things who make you who you are, and you still have time and energy to farm. And we start thinking about the future of food, indigenous food in a changing environment. I think that's one thing that's changing. And I think talking about it from a gender standpoint, to be able to go out there and farm, as hard as that is, we talked about the hottest July on record, you were out there in the hottest July on record, so many days at, 104, 105 degrees, and you're still out there tending your crops and making sure that they're nourished. Brophy already said earlier, they become our children, and you've got all these children of corn and, all these other produce that you have to make sure that they stay alive during 104 degree temperature. Can you tell us a little bit about what drives you to be you and all the things that you are and all the things that you do? And can you talk a little bit, just really briefly, about your work in Santa Fe, your political action work, your voter registration, voter alliance, right there in your own community, and yet you still have time to farm. Can you introduce yourself maybe a little bit more as an Indigenous woman that's multifaceted to include the farming?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Roger. Yeah. So I wear many hats today, and I actually, give a lot of honor and respect to my grandmother and my aunties. I unfortunately lost my mother at a very young age when I was 8 months old, and talk about kinship and talking about spirituality and us as being communal beings. That's what we are, and I've been very fortunate enough to have a big family of strong women who have poured into me and have taught me very many things. And so I have a background of IT. I came from an IT background, had 20 years in IT, worked in different sectors of IT. I left the utility company here back in 2020. And so during that time, like we were talking about of COVID, I think, before that, I was very blessed. I was very blessed that my grandparents left me some land. And I, would go, I grew up there, this piece of land that I inherited. I grew up there. My whole family grew up there, and the house that was there was built from my grandfather and his brothers. And there was a lot of great history and memories and cherishable times with, you know, family and friends. That was like the place that people would go. And unfortunately, the house got burnt down a few times and it became very abandoned. When I got the house, it was non-livable. And so I knew that I had to do a lot of work. At the time, I lost my grandmother, whom also raised me, and I was hers, you know. I was her apple of her eye. And so at the time, my grandfather was still alive, and you know, he was really excited for what was to come with this land and how we were going to cultivate it. And he didn't get to see it get knocked down, but you know, I received some funding to get the house knocked down. And during this time that I was in this land, my grandparents were painters, they were beaters, they were farmers, kind of like all these hats that we wear. And so during the time that we knocked down this house, I found a very nice piece of pottery that my grandmother had painted. And that's really what motivated me and inspired me to carry on the teachings and carry on what I think they really wanted. They wanted to have this beautiful place where they could invite community and give their produce to the community and provide for community. And, you know, it was just a beautiful thing that happened. So in 2020, during that time, you know, I just got tired of chasing money. I chased money for a long time in the IT industry. And I was like, hey, you know, this doesn't feel good. I wasn't passionate about it. And so that's really where the work began for me. And so I was very blessed to come into a role of teaching of youth. And so I was hired as the first hiking crew leader in Isleta Pueblo, and I worked with youth from ages 8 to about 16 years old. And this is really what opened up my eyes to the land, and really just what brought me back was seeing these kids being so free and on the land and curious and, you know, wanting to learn, but also, you know, again, trying to figure out who they were. And so this was where I stepped in to show them, like, hey, look, you know, we are indigenous people of the land, just like we talked about the seeds. We are seeds. We are seeds to our mother. Our mother is what grows us. And that was the connection for me when I, you know, was on the land, was thinking like, oh my gosh, just think, we impregnate our mother earth with the seeds, and they grow in this soil in the dark, and they get rooted, and then they sprout, and we harvest. And so being able to correlate that with these kids and teach them that, hey, you know what, we're just like seeds. They come in different sizes, they come in different colors, they have a story, they come from many different places. And so being able to teach them that really also inspired me to really do farming full time. And so I left that career behind and became a full-time farmer. And it took a lot of work. It took a lot of dedication, you know, with being there on the land, being there and speaking to, Brophy said it well, you know, singing to our plants, having that relationship. And that, you know, that's really what I saw it was like all of the teachings that I heard from my grandparents finally made sense. It was like, oh my gosh, that's what they were saying, you know? And it was like, I was finally getting it and understanding what they had said many years ago, and really applying it to my life, really applying it to what I was doing, especially with the youth, and being able to incorporate the language and the traditions and the culture there. And so it really inspired me to, you know, want to grow for my community, wanting to do something more than just chase money. And so that was really the start of this beautiful journey that I was on. And so it really it really helped me understand my place as a woman, as a community member, as an activist, as a community organizer, as an auntie, all those great things, and being able to teach them about the water and, you know, where the acequias come from, and that water is life. That water is an entity of its own, and a mother that also nourishes us as well. And so those were some of the things that I was very blessed to teach, and I'm continuing that way of life for the youth, for my own kids, for those that want to come and visit and help. Those are the teachings that I'm, you know, that I get to offer and to share in these spaces, and it's become a beautiful space for all of us to come together in community. And so, like Roger said, I also hold and wear another hat, and so I also founded. I also co-founded the Isleta Pueblo Voters Alliance, and with some community members back in 2021. The Isleta Pueblo Voters Alliance is a nonprofit, grassroots, nonpartisan organization. And what we do is we empower, we educate, and we encourage our tribal communities to vote, not only on the national, but state and tribal elections. During my time working with the land, and also just being a community member, I have noticed that, you know, I would love to have better representation. And I believe, you know, we as the people we're the voice. We're the people of the land. We're the people that are doing the work. And so it was a really cool thing to put together and have community members step up and help in this process. And during the time of COVID, we did everything online. We created everything online. We had this little initiative called Coffee with the Candidates. So we brought a lot of the candidates onto Zoom, and our community members joined the Zoom call and were really engaged. And I think it really sparked engagement with the youth, with the younger youth. And, you know, they were like, oh my gosh, right? I can log in and, you know, here's tech, right? They can be engaged and involved. And so it's been a really great journey as well with this, and really getting to understand the political process from the tribal perspective. We have a constitution. That constitution was adopted back in 1938, I believe, or maybe a little bit after that. And so, you know, I do a lot of education on Miguel Trujillo. Miguel Trujillo is a Isleta Pueblo member. He served in the Marine Corps. He, you know, is a civil rights activist, and he was really the pioneer for natives here in New Mexico to get the right to vote. And so that's been one of my passions, and I really love carrying on his legacy. And so right now the work that I do is all these things, but also some advocacy, some policy work. I'm here in Santa Fe right now during the legislative session, and I'm hearing a lot of, you know, these bills getting passed or being heard, and some of them do relate to our water. They do relate to our environment, our, you know, the pollution that's here, but a lot of it really, you know, is important. And also with agriculture, you know, looking at our waterways and, you know, how now water has been the topic for many of us, and seeing the drought that we went through last year. We had the Rio Grande go dry, and it was a really sad, scary time, because I don't think many of us have actually seen the Rio Grande go dry. And there were people who would, you know, go out to the Rio Grande, and we'd pray, and we would, you know, just hold each other together and you know, pray for our youth, pray for the future, pray for rain, of course. And of course, you know, having our ceremonies, really believing in that, and being strong in those ways. You know, we are resilient people. You know, we've been through a lot. Indigenous folks have been through a lot, and, you know, to see the environment change in the ways that it does, I think that's our part as stewards of the land, as Indigenous natives and communities, and our part is to have a voice in protecting and co-facilitating the lands that we have, our rangelands, our grazing lands, our farmlands. It's really important that, that we're stepping up to the table and we have representation in all areas of these topics and issues. We have ancestral knowledge. So yeah, so that's where I'm at right now. And, I really enjoy being able to be with the youth. I think that's really what opens my heart the most. And they've healed me in many ways being out there. And so has the land. I think the land doesn't judge us, right? There's no judgment. We go out there and it's this healing energy that we receive. The earth has its own vibration, just like us. We have our own vibration. Food is spiritual, just like us. Everything is anything living is really spiritual, and we're spiritual beings. And so when we see ourselves that way, there's an acknowledgement and respect for life. And that's where we should be, is respecting the lives of all of our animals, our plants, the air. Our breath is precious to us. That's something that we take for granted. We take a breath and we don't think anything of it. But really, that's life right there. We're living, and that's what we're consuming is this air, this beautiful air. And yes, it's been polluted in some areas of our regions. But again, we need strong voices. We need for all of us to step up and do our part so that we can continue the way of life for the generations to come. So thank you.
Janice, thank you. I'm always reminded with your strength to do all the things that you do. It certainly is inspirational to me and many others I know that are able to be fortunate enough to hear your voice and your story. You talked a lot about life. And speaking of life, not to be argumentative, but my brother, my co-founder of Flower Hill Institute, my cultural leader, Brophy Toledo, who spoke early in the conversation, has said on many occasions, when corn dies, we die. And I'm thinking, wait a minute now, is that really true? When corn dies, we die. And again, not to be argumentative, but really to think, if the Rio Grande runs dry, I'm going to Lizette Bailey and I'm going to go move to the Menominee tribe and I'm going to take corn with me. And I think that's the evolution of us Indigenous people, is we've been able to reinvent ourselves kind of culturally, and through all the Trail of Tears, when the Wasaji, the Osage, were marching on the Trail of Tears, and they were the last tribe, the 39th tribe in the Indian Territory called the state of Oklahoma, forced to be removed from their mound building kind of homelands. And they looked back in their rear view mirror and they saw the woodlands, and they looked out on the vast plains of Oklahoma, and they stopped and had a 4-day mourning ceremony, burial ceremony for their medicine bundles, because the medicine was behind them. It was all those trees and all those plants that come from those forests, nothing out there on that plain. So they had to kind of reinvent themselves as people. And I just would ask the group to maybe to start the conversation here at the top of the hour, if corn dies, do we die? If salmon dies, do we die? If buffalo die, do we die? If rice die, whales die? Or do we just continue to reinvent ourselves and evolve as resilient, strong Indigenous people? And we start thinking about those words like self-determination, tribal sovereignty. Well, when I think about sovereignty, sometimes I think about sovereignty as like living on an island. We're sovereign, me and mine right here on this tribe. When in fact, I think our sovereignty, our self-determination, because of our 4-acre laboratory, we are always tinkering. We're always trying to mess with the status quo. And people have told me, Roger, just grow corn and chili. You know how to grow corn and chili. why don't you just do that? Why do you keep messing with humate, manure, and dog food and fish heads and all these other things that you try to tinker with water conservation and soil restoration? Why do you keep tinkering with things? Why don't you just grow corn and chili? It's really because I'm curious, for one, and two, I think that the North Star toward the Rio Grande going dry, the hottest July on record until 2024, is we've got to learn how to do things differently, but remain as the creator intended us to be, indigenous people that are strong and resilient, people. So I would put that question out to the group. Micah, if whales die, do you die? If salmon dies, do you die? If Janice, if corn dies, do you die? I mean, I think start thinking about those kinds of concepts, because food in a changing environment, I think, boy, if we're ever going to be tested, in terms of the kind of path of our people, I'm not sure we're living in the toughest times. I wouldn't say that. I think that, others have lived in tougher times. But certainly these are going to be challenging times for sure, moving into the hottest July on record. Very little precipitation, those kinds of things. So I'd like the group to speak back to, when corn dies, do we die? And give us your perspectives. And this is really open up, Adam, if your students are there, to them to weigh in on the conversation. And let's go beyond the presenters, not not invite the presenters to speak back, but I'm asking the group, when corn dies, do we die? If you understand the context of that phraseology.
Well, Roger, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
So first of all, no, we live and survive. I've often joked about, when salmon may become more scarce, we'll learn how to put tuna on a stick. You've seen the salmon bake on the stick. We can do that with tuna. But I'm very respectful about questioning the words of an elder once before. Very prominent elder talking about, when the salmon are gone, so is the treaties. And part of my language, but I said, hell no. The treaties are legal arrangements between the federal government, negotiated at the highest level with our chiefs. Salmon was just one aspect of what it meant to us to have our traditional resources, our rights to those resources. And I'm done a lot of work with Northern California tribes that have no more salmon left, and they've turned to the lamprey. And there are other traditional resources that we learn to turn to. And I'm also reminded of a river system in the Arctic Circle area that never had salmon. And the elder told me the last salmon river, the most northern salmon river, used to be a couple villages south of us now. Now we have salmon in our river. Salmon are migrating. Climate change is changing how migratory species are recolonizing areas. And so I think about salmon from the Pacific Northwest, and salmon farms in Chile, salmon from Washington State being grown in New Zealand. There's the repatriation aspect of the gene pool I believe strongly about. And I believe in the resiliency of species and the way humans can respectfully and mindfully environmental engineering for habitat reconstruction. So I think there's always a way.
Thank you, Micah. Anybody else want to speak back to that concept? Haley's in chat. We lost our corn for about 70 years. Return seed, returned back to us. That's amazing. We grew that for the first time in 70 years. I would cry if I saw that. If I saw that corn break ground and come up to be even that tall, I would cry that we've survived in the meantime, but we're happy to have it back home with us. What a great story, Haley. Thank you for sharing that. We'll take one more. Anybody else? Because we're going to switch subjects.
Yeah, Roger, this Brophy.
Hey, Brophy.
The reason I was saying when corn dies, we die is because, in our Pueblo world, everything is done through corn, man. Even with that cornmeal. If we don't have cornmeal, man, no ceremony will be alive, because it takes a cornmeal offering to open up our indigenous ways. So, I know that corn has been the process in our daily lives because it's one of the oldest kernels that we brought from time immemorial in our migratory routes. Because every place we settled, there was a field house. And those field houses always grew that corn, that sacred corn that we talk about, because we had those corn mothers that we depend on, and they were always carried on through this progress when we did our migration. So, that's the reason why I keep saying that, when corn dies, we die, because corn is the main reason why we hold on to our traditional ways of life. And, as us earth people, we're all magical people. We all were planted with that seed, grown into this magical person that we are sitting here today with that DNA that's in everyone that still has that memory thought in the process of bringing back that vitality we're all looking for, because that kernel from that corn grown like 5,000 years ago is still being grown today, because we always knew how to preserve it. We always knew how to save it. That's why seed banks are always very important, because it holds on to that memory that we still hold on today. So that thought process that it created is what is still in the process of the ongoing of where we're at and where we're going and how we're going to do this ongoing. So it holds that memory in that kernel. So we just need to keep practicing that process. So it's important, and that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Brophy. And I'm not being totally facetious in challenging Brophy. I'm really challenging all of us. And I use that as an example when we start thinking about the importance of the buffalo, and we start thinking about the importance of the salmon and all those things that have a fragile environmental perspective. And I know that the salmon, the buffalo are more than food sustenance. It really is ceremony. And Brophy said, we wake up in the morning, the first thing is our breath on corn, and that's how we commune with the spirit world, and keep this whole world in balance. We don't pray for ourselves and our households, we pray for the universe, and we pray for all people, and corn is used in that commune for that. I just noticed Marla, she's been here I think for the entire call. Marla Pardilla. Marla, I know as a health statistician, kind of keeping track of our DNA, of our cellular structure, and of our health in that way. When we start thinking about food in the future, food in the changing environment, cancer and all kinds of diseases from, remember, food is poison, and all the things that we willingly, knowingly ingest. Marla, is there any voice you might have to speak back about food in a changing environment? And it could be in a changing health environment, or it could be in a changing environment related to all these, food connected illnesses. Any voice, Marla? She can't hear.
I can hear her in her office talking, so she may not know she's muted. I can
She
walk
may be
over
on
there.
another call, or she's talking to us.
Yeah, I think she's talking, but she's
Marla,
not.
I think you're muted if you were talking to us.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we hear you, Marla. And
Oh,
sorry to
okay.
put you on the spot, but I'm not gonna have you sit in on a call with your incredibly experienced background. Let you just come in and just kind of get away scot-free. We really want to hear your perspective on food in a changing environment, please.
Well, I've been working with food and prevention for many years, with Johns Hopkins University and with Prevention Research Center at UNM. And I think that education is really important, like what you did just now about historical foods perspective, and also educating the the people about where food come from, the respect for the people, and the cultural respect for our foods in the Native communities. That's really important for the future, for our future generations. And just educating the young people, the elderly, about the modern foods and what we have in the modern foods. Like many of you mentioned, the poisons that are in there, what we call poisons, things that are not good for our bodies. And looking at from science perspective, just in a way of prevention. Like right now, obesity is a big problem in our Indian nations, and we're constantly working at new ways how to prevent it, so we can prevent diabetes and other diseases that are affecting our populations. So I just wanted to say that.
Marla, thank you for weighing in. Recognize Marla as a Dene, a very traditional woman from a very traditional family, but also very contemporary with her science, senior science background. So thank you for allowing me the grace to kind of pick on you and ask you to respond. I'm going to wrap it up here, or start heading toward wrapping it up with a comment that kind of taking in some of the local news about this weekend's Super Bowl and Taylor Swift and Kelsey Brothers, and they fully anticipate this being the highest grossing Super Bowl betting in history. Some of the pundits are forecasting $23 billion going into, because it's held in Las Vegas, and everybody's going to go out and have a great time. And why not make, while you're there, go ahead and make that bet. You already bet on your, $1,500 average price ticket to go watch the game. And you think about $23 billion and what that could do to food insecurity, to health, to food pantries, to homelessness, to immigration. I mean, just the list goes on in terms of, what that money could go for. And again, that money is for fun on one weekend, right? I've got $1,500 that we're pledging to Cotton Blossom Farm, because we want to demonstrate that we could build a bathroom outside for farmers, because you get a lot of kids out there, right? And you get others that are coming to visit the farm. I'm looking for somebody to match my $1,500 commitment to Cotton Blossom, so that we can get those bathrooms built. And you think about $23 billion. So how can we, non-federal, non-program, non-rich people, kind of support each other in a way that's respectful and impactful to be able to do something? So I would ask us all, as we start going into this weekend, to start thinking about what we can each do. Because again, when we start talking about the power of one, and you start thinking about the 25 people, senior scientists, IT people, tribal leaders, Chris Roper, who's on a plane 4 or 5 days a week. I mean, amazing people, and they're all together on one screen. And what can we do if we put our heads together and said, we could do this? If we just picked even something small, what is it we can do? So I want to leave the last question to all of us, and maybe using chat or using your voice. What can we do? What can you do? What can I do that would be impactful around food in a changing environment? Any voices? Any chat?
I have one comment. I like what
Yeah.
Marla said, and I think she's correct. I think education needs, how many of us go to the store and look at the back of the packages of food that we're actually buying? And if we understand what those labels meant and what is going into our bodies, we might be a little bit more aware of and conscious about what we're putting into our bodies. And so education is one, and also local access. Having local access, like you said, not having to drive 38 minutes or 40 minutes away, really supporting our local farmers, having a place for us to give our food, sell our food. So those are just some solutions that that I hope that we can collaborate on, and it becomes a network. And our ancestors had routes. They already had routes back in the day of how they were trading, and so we need to just continue those pathways of being able to have access to healthy foods.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, no, I resonate with what everybody's talking about. I think it is just that it's creating space to be able to share in our foods, because a lot of our homelands have have modern systems of food products, right, that we don't understand, and we've been so disconnected from our natural environment, our natural worlds that are right outside, that I think our intent collectively is to share our understanding, our growing understandings, and also create the space and develop the space to be able to grow from that understanding. If it's through stories, if it's through media, if it's through research, and the one thing that we really do is that we do hands-on demonstrations, right, to be able to connect ourselves back with our food, because that's the real mindset, that's the real change that happens, is being able to touch that food, to be able to create a food product from that. And then also I want to highlight, it's conversations like this, being able to have these conversations like this, so then that we can share, right, our experiences and hear our experiences from other relatives that we probably wouldn't see, but to be able to share these stories and opportunities is one of the things that I really value, is being able to create space in all opportunities to be able to share what we were working on.
Thank you, Nick. Anybody else? 2 more minutes, 3 more minutes. Closing words.
I guess I think a lot of examples around the planet and how human resiliency works with confined spaces. I'm reminded of the population density in South Korea when I witnessed a lot of community gardens around areas where heavy traffic existed. So you think about all of the green belts in between the freeways. I mean, how many acres? I mean, not that it's feasible in today's American system, but in other countries, local food supply is pretty important. So around all these highways and bridges, and in the traffic patterns around big city in Korea, I mean, I couldn't believe there was gardens and people gardening with cars. I mean, they found spaces to to grow their own food. And yeah, just thinking about infrastructure. How can infrastructure be reprogrammed for food security on a local supply and demand chain?
Necessity is the mother of invention, Micah.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Professor Silver, is there anything that we haven't covered that you were hoping for us to cover, maybe?
No, it was fantastic, and I really want to thank you all for being part of this and for arranging it. I think it was really informative and such a substantive conversation, and it's given me a lot to process and think about. And I could probably say the same for my students. I really want to thank you for such a wonderful conversation.
Please let us know.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Roger.
Oh, I was just going to say, I said at the top of the facilitation that we would probably run out of time before we run out of conversation. I think we can continue this conversation, and Dr. Silver, if there's anything that we can do moving forward, continue the conversation, to do another one of these. I think it would be a natural and fairly easy thing to do. And if everybody if the 25 people brought one person, we'd be 50 people on the next one. I'd like to thank Shondine for organizing this event, for facilitating this event, and curating the panelists, and working to arrange for this amazing conversation. Shadeen, thank you very much for all you do for Indian country. And thank you, presenters and students and just the kinfolk from everybody for joining this this event. There's nowhere else I would want to be right now than in this conversation.
Thank you. And I'd love to continue this conversation some point in the future. We will definitely be in touch to figure out how best to do that. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention really quick before we kind of end the meeting. Today's event was recorded. And so the discussion today will be available on the official Flower Hill Institute YouTube channel. So if there's any need to kind of come back, revisit this discussion, or kind of take note of something that you wanted to dive in deeper later on, this will be available on the Flower Hill Institute YouTube channel.
Nice.
Awesome.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, of course. If there's nothing else, I think we can go ahead and end it here. I appreciate everyone kind of showing up and everyone kind of taking part in today's discussion, and have a happy, good rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you. You too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank
All right.
you so
Thanks,
much.
everybody.
Thank you, guys.